The Dales Way stretches for almost 80 miles from the outskirts of the West Yorkshire town of Ilkley to the bustling shores of Lake Windermere. It's one of the finest middle-distance walks in Britain, constantly beautiful and full of interest. That it passes through some of the most stunning scenery and a landscape steeped in history is simply a bonus of the most satisfying kind. I'm Mark Richards, and I'm going to be taking you through a succession of unforgettable landscapes from the Yorkshire Dales right through to the Lake District. From the outset, you are left in no doubt about the appeal of the journey, starting in Wharfedale, framed by green hills, and visiting the villages of Burnsall, Grassington, Kettlewell, Buckden and Hubberholme, before changing direction into Langstrothdale to climb over the moorland watershed into the embrace of Dentdale in Cumbria, where the villages of Dent and Sedbergh await. Beyond the river Lune lie the Lakeland fringes, where limestone walls pattern the fields, leading you on through wooded dells to the shores of England's largest lake, Windermere, where you arrive, perhaps not a little incongruously, amid the heady bustle of tourist Lakeland at Bowness. And it all begins here at the delightful little spa town of Ilkley. And what a gorgeous day to start a walk. This is a place that has attracted people for literally thousands of years, and it has developed as a wonderful spa resort. But for me, its greatest attraction is it marks the gateway to the glories of the Dales. Ilkley is a homely place, characterised by wide streets and Victorian architecture. And today the town's heritage and surrounding countryside mean that tourism is a major contributor to the local economy. Ilkley is dominated by Ilkley Moor, the highest part of Rumbold's Moor between Ilkley and Keighley in West Yorkshire. Crowned by peat bogs, the moor rises to 400 metres and is famous for the Yorkshire County Anthem, On Ilkley Moor Bar Tat. Well, this delightful triple arch structure is indeed Ilkley Bridge, built in the 1670s to service the humble needs of the packhorse. And it is today still a very popular pedestrian focus. But most important of all, it is the official starting point to the Dales Way. And whether like me you're just snugly into your boots or arriving here from Shipley or Leeds on one of the connecting countryways, this delightful spot is ripe with anticipation. Especially so as for the first 30 miles to out to shore, you're drawn into the scenic excitements of Wharfedale. For most walkers, the Dales Way is an undertaking of some 6 to 8 days. But with so much crammed into that time, it's vital to build in time to explore, to potter about, to paddle in streams and rivers, to visit churches and the odd pub, to get a sense of the way of life that permeates the course of the way, and the history that has shaped the land and its people. As to your pace, well, I'd take your cue from the rivers you follow. The Wharfe here, the Dee and the Lune, nowhere do they charge around, bar for a few odd moments of madness, preferring to meander gently, switching this way and that, exploring the many nooks and crannies. You should do the same. Take your time. Low Mill Village, at a bend in the river, is a place of refurbished Victorian workers' cottages, built to serve a mill that somehow survived the attention of the Luddites during the troubled times of the 19th century. Addingham is a neat, agreeable village, one that grew largely during the Industrial Revolution. Its greatest claim to fame is that it sheltered the 9th century Archbishop of York, who fled here when the Vikings began their campaign of terror against the Christian Saxons. Addingham Church is one of a few in the area to possess a blue-faced clock. This is a fashion started by the long-established clockmaking firm of William Potts and Sons of Leeds, when they painted the dial of the clock on Bradford Cathedral. Beyond Addingham, the Dales Way ambles above the wharf, keen to make progress. There are no major settlements now, just a succession of ancient villages and isolated farmsteads. From this stretch of the river, there are splendid views to the wooded hillside of Beamsley Beacon, which commands the surrounding countryside as a beacon should, having been used in medieval times to signal events across the north of England as part of a chain of bonfires.
Wow, isn't that gorgeous? The lady here at Ferry Cottage has provided fresh spring water and cupcake, especially for Dales Way walkers. What a lovely gesture. It says a lot about the relationship of Dales walkers with people as they travel through the countryside. And just look, Bowness, 78 3/4 miles. Not far to go yet then.
Bolton Bridge takes the way into the Bolton Abbey estate, centred on Bolton Priory. With just under 12,000 hectares of beautiful countryside, over 80 miles of footpaths, and no less than 5 areas of special scientific interest, Bolton Abbey estate appeals to everyone. As you progress alongside the river, the ruins of Bolton Priory rise starkly ahead against the valley of the Wharf.
In reality, the Priory was the monastic house, whereas of course Bolton Abbey is the civil parish. These are often confused. The original priory was built in the mid-12th century by a group of Augustinian canons on land endowed by Lady Alistair Romilly of Skipton Castle, and over the course of years became quite a focus in Wharfedale and for settlements much further afield.
The Augustinians were popular residents, ordained priests living together as monks, but very much involved with the local people. The priory managed mills and granges far and wide, and at harvest time employed over 1,000 harvesters at a wage of 2 old pence a day. Life around the priory was typically a busy, boisterous affair, consumed by the business of everyday life. Although there were only 15 or so canons, they were supplemented by lay brothers and gentlemen retainers, as well as a motley crew of serfs and free servants, raising the resident population to almost 200.
On a day like today, aren't these ruins magnificent? But in 1537, King Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries threatened the entire priory buildings. But remarkably and wonderfully, the far end survived as the local parish church and survives to this day as St Mary and St Cuthbert. Isn't it beautiful?
Upriver from Bolton Priory, the Dales Way enters woodland flanking the river and leads on into the site of scientific interest that is Strid Wood, a sanctuary renowned for its wealth of flora and fauna.
Wow, what a wonderful place. Witness the harmony of a wild river and ancient woodland. Many of these trees are 300 years old and shelter in excess of 60 species of breeding birds, which with the liverwort, mosses and fungi, well, you don't have to be a naturalist to realise the biodiversity of this gorgeous wild wood. Wow, this noisy spot is the star attraction of Strid Wood, the Strid itself, where the waters of a dozen moorlands are forced through this narrow channel created by this hard, resilient sandstone. You're seeing it now at low water, in effect, in midsummer. But even now it would be foolhardy to even contemplate jumping across. It has claimed many a life down the years, but it's a wonderful spot just to stand and admire raw energy.
After pressing on through woodland, you arrive at Barden Bridge, an ancient monument in its own right, with neat pedestrian alcoves, typical of the time, but ill-suited to modern traffic. Nearby Barden Tower was formerly a hunting lodge, but grew in stature and was refurbished by one of the lords of Skipton to provide a comfortable bed for the night. Now in ruins, the tower was a formidable construction, built with an eye to the marauding attention of Scots. Even so, there's no evidence that the defences were ever put to any test. After the gentle pastures, by which the Dales Way came to Barden Bridge, it continues along the true left bank of the river, looking ahead to wide, open views of Barden Moor. With the wooded slopes of Earlseat behind us now, the Dales Way crosses open farm fields to arrive in Burnsall, first reaching its 5-arch bridge. There's been a bridge across the wharf at this point since the 13th century, although today's bridge dates from the 19th century. Many visitors consider that Burnsall, with its village green, inn and church, is all that a Dales village should be. The setting is attractive from every angle, with the village relaxing amid hill slopes covered with pine, beech, purple heather and bracken. The way continues around the bend in the river towards the church.
St Wilfrid's, amazing old church. There's been a church here for 1300 years. Just think of all those good Burnsall folk, generation upon generation. When the churchyard was extended in 1858, this lich gate was installed, and this really unusual gate was set in here, a curious mechanism swivelling on a central spindle. There's only 4 in the whole country quite like it. And the antiquity of this fascinating old church is further emphasised by this Viking hogback grave, which takes us back more than 1,000 years into the history of the community. And look on the wall, an artist's impression of what the community probably looked like beside the river wharf. Fascinating insight.
Just north of Burnsall, the river becomes more agitated as it passes below the cliffs of Loop Scar. Here the wharf seems to be showing off as it flows through the limestone fault that created the scar.
This is a scene of great beauty, isn't it? But it did have its darker moment. In 1766, Tom Lee, a fiery, violent man from Grassington, tried to dispose of the body of a local doctor whom he'd murdered on no greater pretext than being told to mend his drunken ways. Clearly a red rag to Tom. Amazingly, it took 3 trials to find him guilty, whereupon he was hung.
After leaving Loop Scar, the way crosses the river on a suspension footbridge, built in the 19th century to replace the line of stepping stones just downstream.
Ooh, wonderful sensation of bobbing up and down. Bolton Abbey, they had narrow stepping stones and a wide bridge. Here, wide stepping stones and definitely single file. And a lovely bobbing bridge. It's great to come across here.
Now once more on the true left bank of the wharf, a line of ancient trees lead on, leaving the river briefly to approach the village of Linton on the opposite bank. Although not on the Dales Way, Linton is well worth a visit, its church occupying a bend in the river, and dating from the 12th century. Another set of stepping stones crosses the wharf here, and were used by parishioners in the days before Linton Bridge was constructed. Linton Falls are quite spectacular, bullying away through the rocks of the North Craven Fault, and best viewed from the safety of the so-called Tin Bridge, built in 1814 for workers at Linton Mill. The present bridge is the fourth to span the river at this point, the original being covered with sheets of metal from old oil drums, hence the name. The mill was built in 1790, but there is evidence of a mill on this site since the 13th century. Nearby stands a neat packhorse bridge, grooved by the passage of countless mill workers, churchgoers and animals. This is now known as Little Emily's Bridge, and is thought to date from the 14th century, and to be named after a member of the Norton family who took refuge nearby at the time of the Civil War. Before long, the large village of Grassington comes into view, and it's here that the Dales Way turns inland from the wharf, heading straight up the main street.
You just can't but love Grassington. Here in summer, vibrant with life and people, and abundant with bunting. It's a gorgeous little place, but come here in the weekends preceding Christmas, it becomes a period extravaganza where shopkeepers, visitors and villagers alike dress up in Dickensian costume. It's such a creative little place, full of energy.
Although technically a village, Grassington has the feel of a small town. Its history largely founded on lead mining and textile production. And for many years this provided an important source of income. Once the lead mines closed, Grassington experienced a period of slow decline. But the fall in affluence was regained with the arrival in 1901 of the Yorkshire Dales Railway, which ran between Skipton and Grassington. Today, although the railway has gone, tourism is the mainstay of the village's economy, and its prosperity and popularity is plain for all to see. It's one of the best loved of the Dales towns and villages, and is a useful and important staging post for Dales wayfarers. Beyond Grassington, the Dales Way can make little progress alongside the river, and so it takes to the hill slopes above the village. This high-level route is one of enormous appeal, not least for the views it provides of distant hills and open, windswept moors. Once above Grassington, the way enters the site of an ancient British settlement known as Lee Green, which dates certainly from the Iron Age and possibly much earlier.
Wow, I'm strolling across Lee Green and my eyes lit up when I saw this whacking great mound of loose limestone, and immediately I knew what it was. It was a Bronze Age tumulus. It's been here 3,000–4,000 years. And the society that lived in this part of Wharfedale all that long time ago will have buried the high members of their clan in urns here. It's wonderful to see such a marvellous scene, and all around is a magnificent view, and you can see grass wood directly behind.
What follows, as the way pushes on above Wharfedale, is the most pleasant walking. An elevated stroll through limestone country on old packhorse trails. There is a keen exhilaration here, and the easiest of walking across fragmented limestone pavements and past derelict lime kilns.
This is very encouraging. There's one quite large compound that is protected at quite an area of clints, quite a depth of it, with an old dry stone wall on the top. And it's allowed nature to recover an area that elsewhere sheep have grazed off. So come here, 20 years time, it'll be all the better. Even now in the summer, there's a lot of small wildflowers growing, and there's even liverwort growing on the top of this fence stake. It's most encouraging to see.
The view here is especially pleasing from the conspicuous upthrust of Coniston Pye, a small knoll blessed with enough nooks and crannies to evade all but the most determined of winds.
Wow, look at this for a view! This is the first really grand view of the upper valley as it draws in above Kettlewell, right up towards Yorkshire. And you've got Great Whernside and Buckden Pike, and half left Littondale. A fabulous mountain limestone view.
Further up Dale, the way comes to Kettlewell, a delightful village on the old London to Richmond coaching highway, which struggled, often literally, of the 1 in 4 gradient of Park Rash to the east of the village, bound across the moors for Coverdale. Kettlewell is sheltered to the north, east and west by high fells, and even in the depths of winter, it's noticeably warmer than neighbouring villages. It's surrounded by a remarkable patchwork of medieval cultivation terracing.
Strolling down the street from the church, I have an abiding feeling of a very homogeneous village of vernacular cottages. None of them are more than 250 years old, and yet the village of Kettlewell is much older than this, as of course the name implies, being a Scandinavianised form of the Old English Kettlewell, the stream in the narrow valley. In the 13th century, much as with Grassington, a market was established here, reflecting the growth in the rural population. Later, textiles and lead mining sustained the community, which is a very important and most attractive component of the Dales Way.
Little seems to have changed for a long time, and yet, in spite of a haphazard arrangement of houses, pubs and cottages, there is a welcoming feel about the place. And what may surprise today's visitors is that Kettlewell was used as the location for the village of Ilkley in the 2003 film Calendar Girls. You can buy Calendar Girls Trails brochures in the shops and pubs. In Kettlewell, the Dales Way changes back to the true right bank of the wharf for the stretch up to Buckden. Between the two villages, the river meanders through a wide glaciated valley, carving extravagant loops into the farmland and falling less than 80 feet throughout its length. Just a short way north of Kettlewell, the hamlet of Starbotton gathers on the opposite bank at the foot of Camgill Beck. Here is a collection of 17th and 18th century houses, many a legacy of the lead mining era. But it's a wonder the settlement exists at all. On more than one occasion, the beck has swollen to prodigious size and engulfed the hamlet, with notable success in 1686, when in the space of a few minutes, a terrible storm turned the beck into a torrent, pouring down the hillside. Cottages and newly built houses took the full force of the deluge and were almost swept away. Buckden, the Valley of the Bucks, has been the home of deer as far as recorded history takes us. This is a village with Norman origins, and the last fully fledged village in Wharfedale. For Dales wayfarers, it is the last opportunity to buy supplies for some time. In former times, Buckden was a bustling place, boasting 3 inns. Now but one remains, the Buck Inn, where long ago farmers would meet to sell their wool. It's at Buckden that the wharf significantly changes direction, heading into the embrace of Langstrothdale, the long marshy valley. Hubberholme, a short distance from Buckden, has a quiet charm about it, appearing in the Domesday Book, although there's evidence of a much earlier presence here, probably dating from Bronze Age times.
This is the George Inn, venue of an annual land letting ceremony which occurs on the first Monday of each new year. Curiously, it takes the form of an auction by candlelight, when bids are cast for the use of the church's own pasture for the coming year. The last bid before the flame flickers out, well, that's the rent payable.
The Church of St. Michael and All Angels is a squat Norman structure with a simplicity of design and delightful ruggedness. When it was first built, it served as a small forest chapel. But the church is particularly renowned for its oaken rood loft, one of only 2 remaining in Yorkshire. It was placed in the church in 1558 and remarkably survived the command of Elizabeth I that all such trappings should be removed.
Look at these delightful little carved mice. They're on many of the pews in this church, and they're the signature of Robert Thompson of Kilburn, the carpenter who built these sturdy pews.
There's also a commemorative plaque to J.B. Priestley.
The church is perched perilously close to the River Wharfe, and at times of flood this has caused quite some problems. There's one recorded instance of fishes in the nave, would you believe?
Hubberholme is very much a tranquil place today, remote and yet a key part of a wider community. It holds more than a passing interest and is likely to detain even those with plans to make haste up the valley. As the way passes up Langstrothdale, there is a growing sense of remoteness. Gone are the comely villages and hamlets to be replaced by isolated farms. This is easy walking, the route never far from the river as it presses on through Yorkshire and so to Dentdale. Between the two lie a Bronze Age arrangement of stones in a perfect ring, known as the Giant's Grave. Yorkshire and neighbouring Dentdale have much in common, but further upriver lies the slightly larger community of Beckermans. The hamlet lies in a sheltered hollow on the edge of Greenfield Forest, presiding over the confluence of Outershore and Greenfield Becks, where the River Wharfe can be said to begin, even though its waters drain from higher ground to come. Outershore is the last settlement of any size in Wharfedale and is surprisingly sheltered in spite of being more than 1,000 feet above sea level. In the 15th century, there used to be 6 tenements at Outershore, all eking a living from the unremitting moorland. Just how harsh an existence that may have been will become evident to anyone passing this way in poor weather conditions. Here, now, everything seems suddenly harsh and demanding. The Dales Way is about to leave Wharfedale and venture across a stretch of wild moorland, before descending into the relative tranquillity of Dentdale in Cumbria.
I'm spurred to look at the map at the moment because Outershore Beck comes along here and drops over a watershed there into Cambeck. Now that's a watershed, actually of Britain to be precise, but the Dales Way, which wends along here up to Cam Houses and the woodlands beyond, clearly rises. It's a bit of an optical illusion. It's one of nature's little tricks.
Cam Houses, the most remote of the outside farms of Wharfedale, today provides holiday accommodation for Dales visitors seeking seclusion. Here it is said a man once sold his wife for 5 gold sovereigns, a horse, harness and a cartload of peat. By all accounts, it was filling the cart with peat that finally clinched the deal.
I'm coming upon the high horizon above Cam houses, and behind me I've got a marvellous view of the upper realms of Wharfedale. And at this point I join what was a Roman road linking their forts at Bainbridge with Ribchester. It later became a wool traders route, and in the 1750s a turnpike route. This was abandoned for the gentler gradients of Whittle down into Hawes. Well, I'm clearly leaving the embrace of Wharfedale, and although the underlying geology is the same, there's a sense of change and excitement in the air, emphasised all the more by the presence of Yorkshire's famous three peaks, which include Pen-y-Ghent, the Hill of the Wind, Ingleborough and Whernside. Their beguiling presence in the landscape have been an inspiration to walkers for generations. There, I've just completed the Cam High Road, and for a time I was sharing strides with the Pennine Way, that wonderful green trail that runs the length of the Pennine chain. Behind me is Gale Beck, which I've just crossed, and this is a major early tributary of the River Ribble, which runs down to the sea below Preston. Here I'm about 35 miles into the route, which is almost halfway, and my attention's moving from Ribblesdale into Dentdale.
Now it is time to leave Yorkshire and press on into Cumbria, though not until we pass beyond Sedbergh will we finally leave the Yorkshire Dales National Park. After a brief moorland skirmish, the way begins the long descent into Dentdale. This is a valley of rare beauty, green, fertile, a welcome place of seclusion surrounded by steep-sided fells. The first community of any size is the village of Dent, although the Dalesway doesn't actually pass through the village, but no self-respecting wayfarer would pass Dent by. Apart from its welcome array of accommodation, shops, cafes and inns, it is quite simply a most endearing village, once described as terrestrial paradise.
To the first-time visitor, Dent Town, as it's long been known, makes a great impression. Its cobbled streets, its lovely little cottages and nooks and crannies, all wrap up to make a delightful little community, right at the heart of Dentdale. And it was here in 1785 that the Reverend Adam Sedgwick was born. He rose through scholarship to become, for 55 years, Professor of Geology at Cambridge University, then a very new science. Along with Murchison, defined Cambrian rocks, Devonian rocks, and the sequence of Carboniferous rocks that underlie this landscape here. But his scriptural upbringing shackled him when confronted by Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. The whole notion of evolution through natural selection ran completely counter to his biblical understanding, and he became an outspoken critic of Darwin. But he loved Dent and longed to come back here in his old age.
Here you still find cobbled streets and closely packed houses fighting for space around the 12th century church of St Andrew. Many of the taller houses in Dent once had first-floor galleries, where local knitters sustained a thriving cottage industry, knitting garments from which Dentdale ultimately derived its share of fame. Throughout Dentdale, the valley is formed around the River Dee, which later joins the River Rothay for the final stage to Sedbergh. But here the Dales Way takes a little shortcut, heading first for the hamlet of Milthrop. Sedbergh, which lies just off the Dales Way, might be forgiven for admitting to a slight identity crisis. Although within the county of Cumbria, it's actually the largest town in the Yorkshire Dales National Park and was once in the former West Riding of Yorkshire.
Sedbergh, or to some locals, Sebbergh, is the English book town, and is widely known for its independent school, among whose former pupils was Will Carling, the English rugby captain. Historically, rather like Dent, it relied heavily on knitting for its income. And it is said that George Bernard Shaw acquired his socks here, so impressed was he by their quality.
Beyond Sedbergh, the route finally leaves the Dales behind and heads for the limestone glory of South Lakeland. Between the two, the intervening tract is noticeably different. Neither Dales nor Lakeland. A place with its own unique appeal.
This is Howgill country, named after this fine group of fells that rise to the north of Sedbergh. For Dales Way walkers, this is a peaceful interlude, a time for ambling with the rivers rather than pressing on, a time for replenishing the batteries before the final scamper over to Bowness.
Here the Dales Way changes direction and heads north to enjoy a woefully brief interlude with the sparkling River Lune, which can be crossed by Lincoln's Inn Bridge. Nearby Lincoln's Inn, now a farm, once served travellers and drovers waiting to ford the river in the days before the bridge was built. The path leads beneath the Lune Viaduct, a classic piece of Victorian railway architecture, recently beautifully restored by English heritage, though no longer a functioning bridge. This section of the way offers splendid views of the Howgills.
Well, I've walked from the Lune Viaduct to the Crook of Lune Bridge where I stand now, following the River Lune upstream by a succession of enchanting meadows, by a string of farmsteads in the lap of the Howgills, and I've loved every stride.
The Dales Way heads west across the M6 motorway, where traffic speeds northwards through the Lune Gorge between the Howgills and the virtually unknown eastern dales of the Lake District. The West Coast Main Line Railway also passes this way. But if George Stephenson had been allowed to have his way, the gorge may still be free of traffic noise. In 1837, Stephenson proposed that the West Coast Line should resort to embankments sweeping across Morecambe Bay and along the West Cumberland Plain. But it was not to be, and in December 1846, the Lancaster and Carlisle Railway over Shap Fell was finally opened. Onward now the Dales Way enters the South Lakeland fringe, a delightful canvas of hillocks and hummocks, farmland and woodland. Here the way teases a course that is both a complete contrast to what has gone before and an experience of immense pleasure.
You sense the end is near, but there's no desire to race on. It's as if the way is deliberately trying to slow you down, to tug you back, to pay more keen attention on this delectable limestone countryside. Throughout this passage, there is a strong sense of isolation, despite the numerous farms encountered. For the walker who loves solitude, they will find it here.
When civilization does return, it comes in the form of the village of Burnsall, although the route finds a way round rather than through the village. Straddling the River Kent, Burnsall is sheltered on the north by Pot of Fell, while Burnsall Hall, a semi-fortified house with a 14th century peel tower, lies on a raised tongue of land near the confluence of the rivers Kent and Sprint. Burnsall boasts a happy state of independence. The same was not always true of Staveley, the next village to appear along the way. Until a new bypass brought much-needed relief, Staveley's greatest claim to fame was its reputation as a bottleneck for Lakeland traffic. Staveley sits neatly across the entrance to the Vale of Kentmere, at the confluence of the rivers Kent and Gowan. This superabundance of water was an important factor in the location of many industries during the 19th century. The production of wooden bobbins for the Lancashire mill industry and the manufacture of gunpowder, dependent not only on the ready availability of coppiced wood, but on the proximity of fast-flowing streams too. As a result, there was a marked concentration of bobbin manufacture along the Kent, particularly at Staveley, where one company alone employed over 200 men and apprentices. The scenery in this tranquil region is typical of outer Lakeland, and all part of its unique and magical appeal. In the lost hinterland around Crook and Nether Staveley lie broad green pastures, punctuated by rocky outcrops and dotted with trees. Yet you could be so easily in another world. This is a perfect, relaxing prelude to the grand finale, a last, timeless corner in which to appreciate everything you have experienced along the way. From time to time, glimpses appear of distant blue hills, the fells of Lakeland, at last. Yet the Great Lake of Windermere remains elusive. These farm buildings around Outrang Nook were once dilapidated, but today have been renovated and new life brought to this remote spot. Hag End Farm, the only dedicated Dales Way tea room, is the perfect spot to stop for an ice cream before the final stage to Bowness.
The final days of any long walk are often greeted with a sense of relief and elation. But with no relent to the scenic qualities, these emotions are accentuated on the Dales Way. Having strolled through a pastoral landscape, it arrives with immense delight and thrill upon a majestic panorama of Lakeland fells. What a scene!
Suddenly the end is drawing you on, down and down through woodland to the very edge of bustling Bowness, one of the oldest settlements in the Lake District, and today a huge contrast with its early days.
Bowness, or to give it its proper name, Bowness-on-Windermere, lies about halfway up the 12-mile length of Lake Windermere. The name alludes to the low curved headland that projects into the bay towards Bell Island, and whilst the community is of some antiquity, it only developed as a resort town with the arrival of the branch railway from Oxenholme via Kendal to Windermere in 1847.
As you descend the final lane, the trappings of modern tourism appear. gift shops, pubs, cafes, restaurants, hotels, and places to buy a well-deserved ice cream. Bowness-on-Windermere is arguably Cumbria's most popular destination, with the town busy for much of the year. People come to enjoy the lake for sailing and water sports, or just to relax and enjoy the atmosphere of the area and the town's delightful setting. The Victorian influence can be seen everywhere. In the late 19th century, wealthy businessmen from Lancashire built large houses overlooking the lake, and many of these now see duty as luxury hotels.
What a strange sensation, after all the peace of the trail, to land here among the day trippers of Bowness. And yet it's one of the great attractions of the Dales Way that you're never far from places of cultural interest or exquisite natural beauty. After more than 80 miles of happy wandering, you may feel tired, but if you're anything like me, your head will be filled with memories, rich, vivid memories that will tug at your heart and demand your return.